days, Jane Ward, who I think is preparing things, has just been working on the woodwork. And Sharon, too, and her friend Bob, oh my gosh, they've just brought it to life. So it does take a lot of people to get the job done. But just a week ago, that house wasn't looking like it is right now. We've got a long ways to go. We've had an original mission to save both Roethke houses. The two brothers, Carl, the accountant, and Otto, the garden master, the poet's father, ran a floral company. And if you see the fence in the back, the greenhouses started right about where that fence is. And they went back 600 feet. They had many greenhouses, 25 acres all the way to Division. Twice the length of a football field, their greenhouses, just mammoth. And then they shipped the flowers out by rail. Roethke experimented with poetry. He was always looking for the line. And his father experimented with roses. And so they were really more alike. But his father died when Roethke was, as you know, you've heard the tour, but he was in junior high. And that's an awkward time. That's an awful time to lose a parent. But he was awkward. And his father was always sort of a gruff, a man's man. Roethke was sweet and didn't want animals killed and sensitive. So they weren't cut out of the same cloth. But I'm just so glad you're here. You're helping us with our fundraiser also, and also our announcement to the community that we're here to stay. We're here for poets, we're here for culture and education, and one house will protect the other. So we've taken on the original mission of two houses, and we're doing well, but we're climbing uphill. So thank you for coming, and now it's my pleasure to introduce Donny Winter. Carbon footprints available, right? And the Roethke house wants to put one in our library for sure. Okay, back to Donny. Donny is an LGBTQ poet, educator, and activist residing in Saginaw, Michigan. So you're a neighbor. In addition to writing, he teaches poetry at Delta College, composition at Saginaw Valley State University. His first full-length collection, published by Alien Beta Press, Carbon Footprint, immediately debuted at #1 on Amazon's new release list under the gay and lesbian poetry category. Winter's poetry discusses LGBTQ topics inspired by his experiences living in rural Michigan. Additionally, he weaves together narratives about trauma, survival, and eco-awareness throughout his work. In his first full-length collection, Donny Winter takes readers on a journey through his experiences as a gay man living in rural Michigan. His confessional poems, framed in both experimental free verse and tanka styles, use multiple nature-themed metaphors to create commentaries about LGBTQ healing and mental health, while also weaving a pro-environmental narrative acknowledging our planet's trauma. Together, our bodies hold history, much as our planet does, and Carbon Footprint acts as a written, fossilized record, mapping a way toward healing through unearthing our own histories. There's so much there, Donny. Oh my gosh, we could certainly stir the pot with Roethke and with your thoughts too. But welcome, and now the podium is all yours.
I tried, and it's at the max.
Okay.
Yeah, so you're going to have to, maybe even if you want to hold it.
I'm pretty loud. I think we're good.
Oh,
We're good.
Don't feel like you have to sit that far away. You can move the chairs anywhere you want.
Well, thank you everyone for coming tonight. It really means a lot to have you all here, and thank you, Anne, for that wonderful introduction. Just to give you some background a little bit, Theodore Roethke is one of my big inspirations as a poet. It goes all the way back to when I was doing my undergrad at Central Michigan University. When I was a baby poet, one of my mentors essentially read one of my super nature-y poems and was like, Donny, wow, like this kind of reminds me of how much Theodore Roethke enjoyed nature. And at that point in time, I kind of was like, I don't know who this poet is. I was very not exposed to poetry, so I did some researching and fell in love with Roethke. So, and that's, I don't know, for me, it's a very full circle moment because it's something that I'm very passionate about, poetry, writing about nature, and the opportunity to weave in my own experiences as an LGBTQ plus person makes it even more wholesome for me to do. So thank you for being here, and I hope that you enjoy these poems. To celebrate Roethke's legacy first, I would like to perform a couple of his pieces. And the first piece that I would like to perform is from his first collection, which is titled Open House, and the poem is titled The Unextinguished. Clouds glow like coals just fresh from fire. A flare of western light leaps with intenser blaze to conflagration in the upper air. All distant shapes turn brighter to the gaze. The fire of heaven dies, a fire unseen, wanes to the febrile smoldering of sleep, deep hidden embers smothered by the screen of flesh burn backward to a blackened heap. But morning light comes tapping at the lid, breaks up the crust of cinders that remain, and pokes the crumbled coal the ashes hid, until thought crackles white across the grain. Now, I'm guilty confession. These are my favorite poems, so this gave me a convenient excuse to read my favorite Roethke poems, of course. My next one is actually the first poem that I ever read of his, and it is Cellar. I'm sure some of you might be familiar with this poem, of course, and it makes me happy, and I'll explain a little bit more why it makes me happy afterward. Cellar. Nothing would sleep in that cellar, dank as a ditch. Bulbs broke out of boxes, hunting for chinks in the dark. Shoots dangled and drooped, lolling obscenely from mildewed crates, hung down long, yellow, evil necks like tropical snakes. And what a congress of stinks. Roots ripe as old bait, pulpy stems rank, silo-rich, leaf mold, manure, lime, piled against slippery planks. Nothing would give up life. Even the dirt kept breathing a small breath. So, one common theme that I see throughout Roethke's poetry that really resonates with me is, like, he had this tendency of writing about a lot of, like, darker content, especially mental health related things. But judging based on those two poems, he does have this very distinct underlying passion for survival. Like, there is always, like, this spark of survival in his work that really inspired me, and it continues to do so. So, moving on to my own collection. It's been long in the making. There are poems in it from like 10 years ago, so very old. But most of it was written last year during the pandemic, because as a poet, what do you do during a pandemic when you're bored and stuck at home all the time? You write, right? So that's what I did, and it happened. It all came into perspective, and it was very surreal, and still is very much surreal for me to this day. So the first poem of mine that I would like to read is definitely a nature poem. If you get my collection and read it, you'll quickly realize that I have a very strange obsession with geology and geography. So some of these poems will definitely speak to that. This poem is titled Subduction, which is the act of tectonic plates decaying. I was really obsessed with it for like a good month and decided to write about it. Subduction. Some days the earth gets tired, weighed down since the century before last, too exhausted to move plates, too drained to flush basins. Some days she's a mother with stoicism etched in bare granite, bearing storm after storm until depression congeals in striations across semi-precious tourmaline, not quite quartz. Some days she wonders if an empty nest would have been better, and muses on the lush tapestries that once covered her hearth. Now, in silence, she subducts tragedy of what she once knew and reduces carbon memory in a flow of glacial brew. So I did have everything tabbed, and I'm like messing up my tabs. So carbon footprint is largely about my experiences as an LGBTQ plus person growing up in rural Michigan. So, as you might imagine, there is some good and some bad, right? And middle school and high school were probably the worst times for me because there was a lot of bullying, there was a lot of adversity, and that I wrote about that at length in this collection, and this poem is an example of that. This poem is titled, Boys Will Be Boys. Recess was always the worst, a time when excess became the ideal best. We'd shift across the playground stage, tried to impress the girls, arm wrestled each other and stood proud on monkey bars like Kong atop a skyscraper. Everyday competition was our ceremony, our rite of passage. Whoever ran the fastest, spat the furthest, yelled the loudest, was the quarterback who determined those in every pack. Some of us never measured up, but at least we took pride in something. We sat on sidelines with worth measured in how often we'd hear different slurs or wimp. At least we were seen, though, right? Today, fathers, brothers, uncles, and friends still measure us against macho men, carefully wait to see if we play that game of football, drink that bottle of beer, drive that stick shift, or slay that deer. With subtle precision, they mansplain masculinity, teach us stoicism, shape us into pressure cookers like volcanoes with granite lids. They tell us to let our cuts bleed, to play in dirt until our emotional dysfunction suctions us into mud fugues. Even now, our upper lips stiffen at the thought of breaking down. So we harden our blood into concrete and swig a beer to hide a frown. Today, we hide in bathrooms, the only safe place to let our molten interiors out. We stare at who we've become in mirrors and strain to understand what manhood's all about. I swear not all of them are sad. I promise. Okay, so this next poem, it was really difficult for me to write because it's a newer experience, let's just say. But we were at a store probably about a year ago, and I noticed, like, my partner and I were at a store, and kids were kind of like pointing at us and staring at us, because that's of course what kids do. But I overheard a comment like to this child's mother asking the person about, are these two guys together? Like, what's going on? They were really confused, let's just say. And I couldn't stop thinking about the mother's reaction. The mother just kind of was like, don't worry about it. Like, don't think about it. Don't acknowledge it. And in the back of my mind, I kind of eye-rolled, but you know, that's what happens. So I wrote this poem about it. It's titled Abrasion. It's a wonder we're still here. Our warranties expired in high school after years of gradual wear. Now war-hardened bodies sit in offices, classrooms, and gyms with hope that the daily grind will alleviate us of every slur. distract ourselves from the adult bullies who still throw around the word queer. We strive to stride with hands held, yet sometimes we stand in supermarkets like anxious deer with ears held back, only to wonder if we'll hear another slur. Children point at us, ask parents for explanations at all the inopportune times, but get no response. The historic perpetuation of misinterpretation we all still find. Our partnered palms sweat when we think of Matthew Shepard. Our skin crawls when we remember Pulse. Our families worry when we're out, but we know our closet doors fell off long ago. So don't worry, Mom and Dad. We're happy the way we are. So we'll fly our flag as high as we possibly can and be the foundation on which the new can stand. The years of painful abrasion won't destroy us because now we're smooth fields of granite. So, the next poem I'm going to perform is the title poem of my book, Carbon Footprint. It's one of the last poems I wrote. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was written in July of 2020, and we can kind of remember how horrible July of 2020 was in a variety of different ways. So I wanted to try to capture the essence of what last summer felt to me. So here it goes. Carbon Footprint. The sun seems angry this summer as each day measures in asphalt cracks. The remaining grass patches beneath the backyard maples have gone arid, and their crisps are muffled under each footfall, like the pops of bacon in a pan. While the pride flag, bleached and frayed, whispers as it waves July goodbye on a humid wind. As I shift with shortening shadows, I pray with roadside chicory for respite and sing for rain with a passing oriole whose beak has grown leaden in this drought. Even the stationary tractor in the field creaks and hides behind heat ripples like a man-made mirage. So, dear planet, let this summer pass. Let this industrial standstill reinvigorate your hope in us. Permit those storm heads to peak above the west long enough to swallow the sun and retract these swords of grass to their sheaths. And give us the baptismal downpour necessary to soak the brine from our veins, to erode the walls we build to keep you contained. Who wants another pandemic poem? I got another one. I think this was probably in May or June of last year. I'm sure many of you may connect with this experience, but I was just sitting in the house, kind of having an existential crisis over the state of the world, and thinking about the fact that nature doesn't really care about what we're going through. Like, nature is still doing its thing, the earth is still spinning, let's just say. And I titled this poem, The World Still Spins. We hide behind our battened hatches, ready for walls to tumble inside ourselves, while we're painfully aware that the world still spins. We loom behind our windows and watch the days that pass on the outside until they shrink into portholes too bright for our eyes. Worry about the hoards we keep, because there's never enough, and fear the shadow titans that stretch across our floors. We see ourselves as insects trapped in amber as dusk sees through us in overexposed sunlight, and the robin sits high on the line still singing, "Don't worry, you're not going to die." The world keeps its spin as the rivers steer clean routes through unlittered woods, and we, sanitized and scared, dream our homes sarcophagi. So, this poem is another geology-themed poem, as you might imagine. This one is about the act of the Earth's magma churning beneath us, convection. And it is a mental health food. I sink into worn upholstery after today's fall, with each effect on tomorrow measured in calculated stints of self-deprecation, an inner pressure valve. Walls of trees blur past as I travel the pavement river toward a home I know is ahead. Somewhere, while a plume rises in my chest like an unyielding spelunker scaling my rib cage, I won't let him out. All it takes is something someone said 3 years ago to stir the inner Vesuvius, but it's forced dormant because that's what's expected. Long commutes are unpaid therapy sessions. Sometimes those are the easiest to afford. I was having a rough day that day, as you might imagine. So I told myself that I wouldn't embarrass my partner during this reading, but I changed my mind like I do. And I don't often write a lot of gay love poems, but I do firmly believe the world needs more of those as often as possible.
Right.
So I wrote this poem and gifted it on Valentine's Day, I think. It was like a couple of years ago. And it was a day where we were stuck at home because it had snowed, and it was a snow day, and that's what the poem is titled. Snow Day. The Sauvignon sits on the coffee table, a gasoline that gets us through Pokemon battles. Entrails from last night's snowstorm slither away, leaving us battened inside, a pleasant cabin fever. Slowly, sunlight refracts through wine, casts amber across the table and onto you. And there you sit, one leg draped across mine, the other stretched across the table. We knot ourselves together until we lose where we're intertwined, yet as the couch swallows us whole, we laugh and sip our glasses of wine. You smile at me as I doze, which I often do, and call my name to keep me awake. The butterflies that infest my chest carry me beyond the exosphere, where even 1,000 suns pale in the wake of knowing you're still here. You're perfect, you say in a daze, as you reach over to rub my face. As the Sauvignon gets low, you pour more and teach me that I'm good enough. The last poem that I'm going to read for everyone is the final poem in my book, and one that is, they're all very personal to me, but this one is extremely personal to me. So last year, during the, beginning of the pandemic, I was visiting my parents and spending the night in my childhood bedroom for the first time in what seems like a million years. And it was a very surreal experience because it's been turned into this storage room, and there just seemed to be so many relics from childhood because I obsessively would keep everything, papers, old things that I wrote, clothes that haven't fit me since 3rd grade, and I couldn't stop thinking about the closet and what it means to LGBTQ plus people. And I chose to write a poem about this. The poem is titled My Closet is a Reliquary, and it's dedicated to the late Ace London, who was a mentor of mine, an LGBTQ plus actor and activist, and a very dear friend whom I miss very much. My closet is a reliquary. The closet door has fallen from its track and sits, leaned against the dented drywall like a discarded portcullis, too weathered to keep me. Behind box-stacked skyscrapers, yellowed wallpaper peels, and the crayon mural still robs floral print of its optic illusion, like a political graffiti with elementary verve. The shelves still dip under collections of unread religious texts, and bloated plastic drawers refuse to budge from their cheap retail compartments. And each paper-filled basin brims, because the air is linen stale, and the glued constellations above still keep this room lit, while the tired July sun slips beneath the tree line, lengthening each shadow across the brown shag carpet. These years later, I keep the closet door off its track because it's powerless, a prison-made museum, a memorialized wound left open since I left for college after a second birth. Now my closet has lost its echo, and each stored memory maps a misshapen journey. So let these paper roadways return to nature, become overgrown, because this cluttered closet is a reliquary, a room for storage, unable to keep me. And that's it. So I don't know how we're doing on time. What do we know what time? I didn't even bring my phone up here. So
20 minutes to 9.
okay, so I am totally open to answering questions because it's pretty common after poetry readings to do that. So does anybody have any questions or comments or general curiosities?
Were you a high school writer as well, or did you come to it later? And what was that sort of journey where you realized I'm a poet? Like, how did that emerge for you?
I actually started writing in middle school, and I started writing through fan fiction because I was a very nerdy child and just needed to do that. And as I grew older, I started tinkering around with poetry a little bit, and that kind of made me take a deep dive into poetry because I took a creative writing class, and a whole world was opened up to me. I found a way to express myself as a gay teenager without being super upfront about the fact that I am, in fact, a gay person. So it was kind of my way of protecting myself, but still allowing some form of expression that gave me catharsis. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Which is interesting because that sort of brings me to my question, because I think it was the third piece that you read, which is almost like a manifesto but read as prose versus poetry. So I wondered if you have a sense of looking back over the 10 years in this book and see that there's certain pieces that are identified with a frame of writing that actually gives voice in another way that is stronger or different than what you expected to start.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, actually. Thank you for that question. So when I'm putting together a collection, and keep in mind I've only done this once so far because I'm pretty new to putting together collections, but I look at life as being like a television series. Like, we have different seasons or eras of sorts, and I'm very much invested in story writing as well. So when I put together a collection, I think of it as being a story of sorts, right? It's even separated into 3 different sections. So it progressively takes the audience on that experience of realization, of realizing that trauma is there and that it should be acknowledged, and that acknowledgement can sometimes lead to some form of healing.
Art. And art.
And art. Thank you. Any other questions, comments?
So we talked about looking back. What's in the future?
Well, thank you for asking. It gives me a chance to do a shameless plug for my next collection. I swear I'm going to be louder than those. My next collection is coming out in October, actually. After the success of this book, it really empowered me to write more regularly. And it's made me happy as a teacher because I've been able to kind of use it as an example to students too, of here is why you should keep writing, here's what you can achieve with it. And my next collection, which is titled Feats of Alchemy, it's very much darker than Carbon Footprint. I try to think of it, I tell people that I think of it as the angsty, annoying middle child of what I envision my collections will be, if that makes sense. So that's on the horizon. And tomorrow, actually, to do a plug for our open mic night, I will probably read a couple of pieces from it, so no pressure. Any other questions?
As a teacher, do you find yourself inspired by your interactions?
Yes, all the time, actually.
Yeah.
He asked if, during my interactions as a teacher, if I'm ever inspired by those interactions with students. And I very much am all the time, because I teach creative writing at Delta. And this even happens in my composition courses, both at Delta and SVSU, but I will always have students come to me who are really excited about writing, who have never really had anybody read their work before, and just having the act of somebody reading and acknowledging their work and providing them constructive and complimentary feedback is so validating. And it's funny that you mentioned this, because about 2 years ago, I had one of my poetry students come in to a one-on-one conference, and they were like, "Professor Winter, do you have any collections of poems that you've written that I can read?" And at that point in time, I was like, "No, I don't. Sorry. Like, here's a couple that I have that I've published in journals, but now that I've been able to like have a collection successfully get published, it's like I've seen students get really interested, and they've started believing in themselves when it comes to putting together a collection of work. And it's my goal in my classes now to model that for them too, so they can see that it's not this daunting, impossible process. It takes work, and it can be very frustrating sometimes, but at the end of the day, once you do that, once you produce that work and send it out there, you don't know whose lives you'll touch, right? And it'll feel very wholesome and validating. Thank you.
Yeah, so with the UN's report on climate change coming out this week, I think it's more important than ever for people to embrace any tool possible to understand kind of the pain that the planet is in, to speak, on a more emotional sense. Like, so your poems being very, like, it's not even really a real term, but I'll just say like anthropomorphic in a way.
I love that
like,
word.
I think it reaches people that sometimes the science and the numbers might not, like people who need to see maybe their own mental health struggles reflected in the struggles of the planet or things like that. So I really appreciate the geographic symbolism that you bring into your work, because I think it speaks to kind of an audience that needs to hear it, that might not be, in some of those other sides of the tools of communication around those struggles.
I really appreciate you saying that.
Well, what's really interesting to play off of that is in Europe, it's front page news and what they've done, and I don't know, in the last 5 years, they've had ships of artists, some of them like Katie Tunstall and other major names in music and fine art, travel to see the glaciers and then write music and poetry and drama and paint images and write, incredible pieces to help, just as you're saying, us link directly to a planet that needs another way to be inspired, people to be inspired by the planet, and that's the way to do it. It's really a great connection.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. That was, of course, one of my goals with this, because as an artist myself, like, our goal is always to get people to listen, right? And ultimately that's people's choice, whether they choose to listen or not. And like, my goal with poetry is to make it as accessible as possible to multiple different groups of people. And I think that's why I really wanted to focus it on the environmental themes, because it affects all of us, whether we're aware of it or not. Like, the earth and what it's going through, it will impact all of us. It has impacted all of us.
Who do you most like to read right now? What other poets are really resonating with you right now at this time?
Oh, don't get me started on that. I could go on for forever. Okay, so obviously Theodore Roethke. In leading up to this reading, I read his first 2 collections. I am very much in love with the poet and spoken word artist Mary Lambert. If you were familiar with the Macklemore and Ryan Lewis song, Same Love, she is the featured artist on that song. I very much love Meg Day's collection, The Last Psalm at Sea Level. Additionally, Mary Howe is one of my favorite poets. Very, very confessional. I'm always obsessed with Sylvia Plath. And I love Emily Dickinson. Lately, I've been reading a little bit of Walt Whitman. Every summer, I try to read at least bits and pieces of Leaves of Grass. So, but those right now are probably my biggest influences, I would say. Any other questions?
I guess what I was curious about earlier, and that is that besides referentially looking at other poets or what you're reading in terms of content otherwise, do you have visual, are you drawn in any particular way to specific artists that also help draw the storyline in your head? I mean, obviously, if you're reading about geomorphology and geography and things like that, it doesn't necessarily bring up artists, but there may be some that are of another, you know.
Like other genres of sorts?
Yeah, but
that...
specifically art, like visual artists, does any of that inform your interest?
I would say that music and music videos really influence my art. Sometimes, I always tell my students, if you want to become a better poet, read other poets' work, right? But I've also had times where I've had to tell students, don't get so caught up in other people's voices that you can't create your own. So when I'm at a point where I'm reading poetry that, I get really caught up in those people's voices, I have to kind of pull back and look at more visual pieces, like music videos, because, music is still poetry, just of a different variety, right? And yeah, and that's what kind of gives me a little bit more, visual inspiration and gumption to continue writing. Thank you. Any other questions? I could answer questions all night. I love talking about my books, so go for it. Thank you. It's been an honor.